I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine you've just buried the person who was your entire world. 40 years of a life built together. Holidays, arguments, laughter, midnight conversations about nothing and everything. All of it, gone. Just like that. And you are still here. Standing in a house full of his things. Breathing air that still somehow smells like him. And you have to figure out what comes next. You take it one day at a time. You decide to keep going. Not because it's easy, but because someone who loved you asked you to. You make small choices. You get out of bed. You eat. You make plans. You even do something brave. You walk into a car dealership and you buy yourself something new. Something that is yours and yours alone. And for the first time in months, you feel a flicker of something almost like joy. And then your own child walks through your front door, picks up your keys, and tells you that you won't be needing them anymore. My name is Edith. I am 65 years old. And this is the story of the day my son tried to take everything from me, and the 4 words I sent that changed everything. To understand what happened, you have to understand what I lost first. Because none of this makes sense without him. His name was Gerald. Jerry, I always called him. I met him at a dance, a church social of all places, when I was 23 years old. I wasn't even supposed to be there. My friend Patricia dragged me, and I went only because I had nothing better to do and she'd called me 3 times that week. I wore a blue dress I'd bought at a sale and I was irritated about being there. And then this man walked across the room and said, very simply, "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." Me too. Want to stand here and be miserable together. I laughed. I couldn't help it. We were married 18 months later. Now, I want to be honest with you because if I've learned anything in 65 years, it's that honesty is the only thing that ever actually helps. Our marriage was not perfect. No marriage is, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Jerry and I fought. Oh, we fought. He was stubborn as a barn door, and I have never in my life been described as particularly easygoing. We had years that were hard. Financially, emotionally, in ways I won't detail because some things belong only to the 2 people who live them. But we were committed. To each other, to the work of it, to the belief that the person across the table from you deserves your patience and your honesty and your effort every single day, especially on the days when you don't feel like giving it. He worked in logistics for 31 years. I worked as a school librarian. We were not wealthy people, but we were comfortable, and more importantly, we were present. Present for each other. Present for Matthew, our son, our only child, who came into the world on a stormy Tuesday in October and who we both loved beyond all measure. We took road trips every summer. Jerry drove. I read the map. We argued about directions at least twice per trip. We'd pull into a diner somewhere in the middle of nowhere and eat pie and drink bad coffee, and I would think, quietly, privately, I could not have chosen better. We built a garden in the backyard that took 4 years to get right. We had a spot on the coast we talked about visiting, a particular lighthouse we'd seen in a photograph, and we always said, next year, next summer, when things slow down. Things never slowed down. And then they stopped entirely. Jerry was diagnosed with a heart condition when he was 61. The doctors were optimistic. Initially. Then cautiously optimistic. Then careful with their words in the way doctors become when optimism no longer serves anyone. He died on a Thursday morning in March. It was raining. I held his hand. He looked at me and smiled, actually smiled, and he said, "Edith, as long as there's air in your lungs, there's a reason to keep going. Don't sit still waiting for life to pass you by. Go out and live it." Then he closed his eyes. And I was alone for the first time in 40 years. I want to talk about grief honestly, because I think we are very bad at talking about it as a society. We treat grief like a project. Like there are stages to get through, boxes to check, a finish line at the end of it. People say things like, "He'd want you to be happy." And they mean well, I know they mean well, but grief is not a project. It is a weather system. It moves in, it changes the atmosphere of everything, and it doesn't leave on anyone else's schedule. The first week after Jerry died, the house was full of people. Family, neighbors, members of our church, colleagues I hadn't seen in years. There was food everywhere, casseroles and pies and a lasagna large enough to feed a small army. People hugged me and told me he was in a better place and that they were thinking of me, and I nodded and thanked them and held it all together because that is what you do when you are in public. Then everyone went home. And the silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was the absence of him. The absence of his footsteps in the morning, which I had heard every day for 40 years and had never once consciously noticed until they weren't there. The absence of his voice calling from the other room. The absence of the small sounds of another life sharing your space, a coffee cup set down, a newspaper folded, a sigh. I slept on my side of the bed for 3 weeks before I finally gave in and spread out across the middle. It felt like a betrayal. Everything felt like a betrayal. Matthew called during those first weeks. He drove down twice, once for the funeral, once about 2 weeks later. The second visit was short. He had work, he said. Things to get back to. I understood. Life continues for the people who aren't the ones left behind. But those were the last 2 visits for a long time. The calls became less frequent. Weeks would pass. I would call him sometimes and reach his voicemail and leave careful, cheerful messages, the kind designed to reassure him that I was fine, so he wouldn't worry, so he wouldn't feel guilty. I was protecting him from my loneliness the way I had always protected him from difficult things, the way mothers do, and it was, I now understand, a terrible mistake. Not because I should have burdened him, but because it meant he had no idea what I was actually going through. There were days that first winter when I did not speak a single word out loud to another human being. I would realize it at night, that I had gone an entire day in complete silence, and it was a strange, hollow feeling, like being a ghost in your own life. I want to be clear, I am not someone who gives up easily. I am not fragile. I had worked through difficult things before. Financial strain, health scares, family rifts, losses. But this was different. This was the subtraction of the person who made you feel like yourself. And without that, you start to wonder who, exactly, you are. I did wonder. For a long time. Some days I sat in his armchair and just breathed. Some days I went through old photographs. Some days I watched the birds at the feeder he'd put up years ago and thought about how he would have liked that particular cardinal, how he would have pointed at it and named it something ridiculous like Gerald Jr. I missed his jokes most of all. That surprised me. Of all the things to miss, a person's humor. But it's true. I'd see something funny on the television and I'd turn to tell him, and the empty chair was always a fresh shock. Grief is full of fresh shocks. That's the thing no one tells you. It doesn't get steadily better. It gets better in patches, and then something will catch you off guard. A song, a smell, a Sunday morning that feels exactly like 100 Sunday mornings before, and it's as sharp as day one. I eventually began to emerge from the worst of it the way you emerge from a long illness. Slowly, cautiously, not entirely sure the ground beneath your feet will hold. I started doing things again. Small things. I rearranged the living room. I planted something in the garden. Just a few bulbs, nothing ambitious. I called Patricia, my old friend, who came over for tea and made me laugh properly for the first time in months. It helped. Everything small helped. And then the car died. The car and the warning signs. My old car had been dying for the better part of a year. It was a sensible thing, a small sedan, well over a decade old, that had always been reliable but had recently been communicating its retirement wishes in the form of grinding noises and warning lights. Jerry had always dealt with the car. The maintenance, the repairs, the conversations with mechanics who somehow always found more things wrong than you brought it in for. He'd handled all of it. This was one of those arrangements that happens in long marriages, not because anyone consciously decided it, but because it simply worked, and so it remained. Without him, I suddenly had to learn things I had never learned. I had to figure out the finances, the accounts, the insurance, the bills. I had to learn what he had known by heart about the house, the appliances, the systems. It was, in many ways, like being handed a job description after the job had already started. But I did it. Slowly and imperfectly, but I did it. And when the car finally gave out entirely on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, I made a decision. I didn't call Matthew. I didn't call a neighbor. I got dressed in a proper outfit, trousers, a blouse, my good coat, and I drove myself to the nearest dealership in Patricia's car, which she graciously lent me with 0 questions asked. I want to tell you about that experience, because it was significant. The salesman who approached me was young. Very young. Mid-20s, I'd guess. He had the polished, slightly performative confidence of someone who had been trained to project authority. And the moment he saw me, 65 years old, silver-haired, alone, I could see him recalibrate. Not rudely. Just subtly. The way people do when they've already made a quiet assumption about what you know and what you want and how easy it will be to steer you. He started talking to me very simply, as if I might not understand complex concepts. He pointed out easy-to-drive options. He mentioned once casually that some of the models had larger text on the dashboard displays. I let him finish. Then I asked very specific questions about the engine, the fuel efficiency, the safety ratings, the financing options, and the full out-the-door cost including every fee. I had done my research. I knew the numbers I was looking for and the ones that indicated a dealership padding its margins. I had spent 2 evenings reading consumer reviews and looking up fair market values. His expression shifted. It shifted all the way to respect, and that felt good. I chose a silver sedan. Mid-size. Practical. Reliable. With excellent safety reviews. I paid partly in cash and financed the remainder through my own bank, which had already pre-approved me. The car was registered solely in my name. I shook the salesman's hand. He called me Mrs. Edith with genuine warmth, and I drove my new car home through the autumn afternoon feeling something I had not felt in a very long time. Capable. That was the word. I felt capable. I sat in my driveway for a moment before going inside. I ran my hands over the steering wheel. I breathed in the smell of it, that unmistakable new car smell that is really just the smell of a fresh start. And I thought, Jerry, I did something today. I called Matthew that evening. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail. Happy, warm, the kind a mother leaves when she genuinely has good news. I told him I'd bought a new car. That I was doing well. That I loved him. He didn't call back that night. Or the next morning. Looking back, I should have recognized that as information. But I didn't. Because that is what we do with people we love. We extend the benefit of the doubt long past the point where the doubt has already been answered. Now, here is the thing I have to tell you, the part that is harder to admit. There had been signs. Small ones. Quiet ones. The kind you explain away because to acknowledge them fully would require you to say something devastating about your own child. Matthew had asked about Jerry's life insurance shortly after the funeral. Gently, but he'd asked. He'd asked if I'd sorted out the will. He'd asked, twice, in different conversations, whether I had thought about what comes next in terms of living arrangements. Whether a house this size was really practical for one person. I had answered carefully each time. And each time, I told myself he was simply being responsible. That he was worried. That he was processing his father's death in a practical way. But I had started to notice something about Vanessa because that was how Matthew handled things. The way she was always present when these topics numbers and plans rather than tears. The way Matthew's phrasing would shift, would become less like him and more like someone who had been coached on what to say. The subtle pressure behind the gentle questions. I noticed, and I set it aside, because mothers do that. But somewhere beneath the setting aside, something was keeping track. Some quiet, cautious, self-preserving part of me that had been paying attention even when I told myself I wasn't. A few days after I bought the car, I called Robert, Jerry's oldest friend. A retired family attorney who had known us for over 30 years and who had always been the kind of man who said exactly what he meant. I told him I was probably being paranoid. I told him I had no specific reason to worry. I told him I felt foolish even calling. He said, Edith, the fact that you're calling me is itself a reason. We talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, we had a plan. B-roll. Woman driving alone, hands on steering wheel, autumn leaves, woman on phone in a quiet kitchen. 2400 hours. 32:00. File folder chapter 4. The glove box. Robert came to the house on a Thursday morning. He brought coffee and a brown leather briefcase and the calm, competent energy of a man who had spent decades solving problems before they became catastrophes. We sat at my kitchen table and I told him everything. All of it, including the parts I'd been reluctant to say out loud, because speaking of fear aloud makes it real, and I hadn't been sure I was ready for it to be real. But I said it. I was afraid my son might try to take something from me. My independence. My autonomy. Perhaps my home. Perhaps even my decision-making rights. Robert listened without interrupting, which is a gift, and rarer than it should be. And when I finished, he set down his coffee and said, "Then we make sure there is nothing to take." What we put together over the next several hours was not designed to punish Matthew. I want to be clear about that. I was not plotting against my son. I was protecting myself. There is a difference, and it matters. The first document was a notarized letter. Formal, legal, clear. It stated in plain language that the silver sedan, registered to Edith Margaret Calloway at my home address, was my sole property, purchased with my personal funds, registered in my name, and insured under my individual policy. It stated that any removal of said vehicle without my explicit written consent would constitute grand theft auto under state law, a felony offense, and that I would pursue full legal consequences without exception. Robert had it notarized that same afternoon. The second document was a certified copy of the car's title, along with a copy of the current registration and a copy of my valid driver's license. All current. All legally binding. All bearing my name and my name only. The third document was the one that cost me the most to prepare. It was a revised will. I had updated it in the weeks after Jerry died, but this revision went further. It removed Matthew as the primary beneficiary of my estate. In his place, I designated two organizations: a local charity that supports elderly individuals living independently, and an animal shelter that Jerry and I had always quietly admired. I didn't make this decision lightly. I sat with it for 2 days. I called Robert twice to ask if I was being too extreme. Both times he said the same thing. "Edith, a will is not a punishment. It's a statement of your values and your wishes. If your values and wishes have changed, then the will should reflect that." They had changed. So it did. The fourth document was perhaps the most powerful one, and the one I most hoped I would never need anyone to see. It was a sworn, notarized affidavit of mental and physical competency. It included the written findings from my most recent medical examination, blood pressure, cognitive screening, mobility assessment, all of it. It included a signed statement from my physician confirming that I showed no signs of cognitive decline and was fully capable of managing my own affairs. And it included a statement from Robert himself, as a legal professional, attesting that in his assessment I was entirely competent to make my own decisions. Robert told me, very matter-of-factly, that forcing a competent adult into a nursing home against their will can constitute elder abuse under state law. That there are legal remedies. That I had options, and that those options had teeth. I had not known that. I think many people don't know that. And I think that's exactly how some families get away with what they do. We put every page in order. Robert made copies. One set for his files, one set for me. I folded my set neatly, placed them in a clean white envelope, sealed it, and wrote 3 words on the front in my own handwriting. "Read carefully. Both of you." I walked out to my silver sedan. I opened the glove box. I placed the envelope inside. I closed it. I went back into my house and I made dinner and I watched television and I went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. They came 2 days later. It was a Saturday. I had been awake since 6. I've always been an early riser, one of those habits from decades of getting Matthew up and off to school that never quite unwired itself from my schedule. I had made tea. I had watered the plants on the kitchen windowsill. I was considering what to do with the day. Perhaps call Patricia, perhaps take a drive somewhere. I heard the front door open at 9:15. Not a knock. Not the bell. The door simply opened, because Matthew still had a key. Had always had a key, because I had given it to him years ago in the spirit of open-armed motherhood, in the belief that my home should always feel like his home too. I turned from the kitchen window. They were both there. Matthew, in a jacket he usually reserved for business occasions. Vanessa, in a way I can only describe as armored, Precise clothing, hair done, the particular look of a person who has prepared for a meeting they intend to control. He walked toward the table without a word, and he picked them up. That is the thing about loving someone. The instinct to be glad to see them picks up something that already belongs to them. I started to smile. To ice. Then I saw his eyes very carefully. They weren't on Matthew. They were on the kitchen table. He looked at me then. And what I saw in his face wasn't cruelty. I want to say that. I do not believe my son is a cruel man. What I saw was something more complicated and in some ways more painful. He had convinced himself that what he was doing was reasonable. He said, "You don't need this, Mom." I asked him to repeat himself. Partly because I could not believe the sentence I had just heard. Partly because I needed a moment. He repeated it. He said I didn't need a car. That I was getting older. That driving wasn't as safe for me as it used to be. That a car was an unnecessary expense. I said, "Matthew, I drove myself to that dealership and back without incident. I have a valid driver's license. I passed every required test. I am a responsible driver and have been for 40 years. And that car was purchased with my own money." He said, "Vanessa and I are going on a trip. Our car's been having problems. We'll take yours. Not borrow. Not could we use. Take." I said, "You'll ask me, Matthew. That's what you'll do." And he said, "And I will hear these words for the rest of my life," he said. "Mom, I didn't come to ask you for anything. I came to tell you I'm using it." Vanessa stood near the door. She had not said a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own kind of statement. The silence of someone who approved of what was happening, who had perhaps authored what was happening, and who was letting Matthew be the one to say it. And then it got worse. Matthew said, still in that same reasonable rehearsed tone, that they could drop me off somewhere on the way. That he and Vanessa had been talking, and they thought it might be time for me to consider a different living arrangement. A nursing home. He used the phrase, a care facility. He said it might be better for me. That I'd be around people my own age. That I wouldn't have to manage the house alone. I looked at my son standing in my kitchen, holding my keys, telling me my life was too large for me. And I broke. Not silently. I want you to know that I broke loudly, and I am not ashamed of it. I cried. I told him that car was my first act of independence in months. That I was not ready. That I did not want to go anywhere. That he had no right. No legal, no moral, no ethical right, to make this decision for me. I told him that this was my home. That I was his mother. That whatever was happening, whatever Vanessa had told him, whatever conversation had led to this moment, I needed him to stop it. To hear me. To be my son again. He listened. And then he walked out the door. Vanessa followed without a word. She didn't look at me. She pulled the door closed behind her with a quiet click that felt louder than any slam. I stood in my kitchen. Alone. The keys were gone. I want to try to describe for you what that moment felt like. Not for sympathy, but because I think it matters, and because I think some of you may have felt something like it and may never have heard it described in a way that matched what you experienced. It wasn't just the car. It was never just the car. The car was a symbol of choice, of movement, of self-determination. Of the promise I had made to myself after Jerry died that I would keep going, keep living, not sit still and shrink until the world moved around me. Taking that felt like taking me. The version of me I'd been slowly and painfully rebuilding since March. And underneath the grief and the humiliation and the disbelief was something I hadn't expected to feel. Rage. Clean, clear, righteous rage. And that rage reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten. I had prepared for this. I walked to the kitchen counter. I picked up my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. That surprised me still, even the second time I noticed it, that in the moment it truly mattered, I had stopped shaking and started thinking. I opened my messages. I found Matthew's name. I typed 4 words. Checked the glove box. I pressed send. Then I put my phone down, sat down at my kitchen table, and I waited. B-roll. A woman sitting alone at a kitchen table, phone face down, morning light, stillness. 44:00, 50:00. Mobile phone with arrow chapter 6. The messages. I had been sitting at that table for 11 minutes when the first call came. I watched Matthew's name light up the screen. I watched it ring. I did not answer. It rang again. I did not answer. Then the texts began. The first one said, "Mom, what is this?" The second, "What does this mean? Call me back." The third, "Mom, please call me. I need to talk to you." The fourth, "Mom, this is a misunderstanding. We can talk about this. Please call me." I read each one as it arrived. I read them slowly. I did not rush. I sat in my kitchen in the quiet of a Saturday morning, and I read my son's messages, and I thought about 40 years of marriage and 40 years of motherhood and every decision I had ever made out of love for the people in my life. The fifth message said, "Mom, I'm looking at these documents. I understand what this means. Please don't call the police. We don't need to involve anyone. Please." And there it was. The moment he understood. Not just that he'd been caught, but that I had been prepared. That his mother, whom he had walked into the house and handled like something fragile and inconvenient, had anticipated him, had made phone calls, had consulted a lawyer, had done what careful, capable, intelligent people do when they sense that someone is not behaving in their best interest. The sixth message said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. Please tell me what to do. Please answer me. Mom." I read it twice. 3 times. I let it sit. Then I picked up my phone and I typed a reply. Not an angry reply. Not a wounded one. Just clear and simple and final. Bring my car back to my house. Right now. Don't stop on the way. Come directly here. His response came in under 30 seconds. We're turning around now. I put the phone on the table. Then I stood up, and I did something deliberate and considered and intentional. I went upstairs. I went to my bedroom. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment, at the face of a woman who had been crying, who was angry, who had just been through something awful and was about to face something harder still. And I decided who I wanted to be in the next hour. I washed my face. I combed my hair. My silver hair, which I had spent years being subtly pressured to dye and had quietly refused to, because I had earned every strand of it. I changed into a dress I liked. I put on lipstick. Not because I needed armor, but because I wanted to feel like myself. Fully, completely myself. I called Robert on my way back downstairs and told him briefly what had happened. He said he was on standby. I told him I believed I could handle the next part alone. He said, "I know you can, Edith. You always could. You just didn't always know it yet." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in the living room, in my own armchair, hands folded in my lap. I was calm. Not numb, calm. There is a difference. I could feel everything, but I was in command of it. I was the one deciding what to do with it. I heard the car before I saw it. My car. The soft, smooth sound of its engine pulling into the driveway. And I sat exactly where I was. I didn't go to the window. I didn't go to the door. I let him come to me. B-roll. A car pulling into a driveway, front door opening slowly, woman sitting composed in a living room chair. 50:00, 58:00. Collision Chapter 7. The Reckoning. Matthew came alone. Vanessa was not with him, and I noticed that. I also noticed that he had the envelope in his hand. He'd taken it from the glove box and carried it in with him, which I hadn't expected. He looked pale, the particular paleness of someone whose color had been stripped out by shock. He looked younger than his age somehow, and more uncertain, and I recognized something in his face that I had last seen when he was a teenager who'd done something he knew he could not argue his way out of. He opened his mouth the moment he stepped inside. I raised one hand. "Sit down," I said. He sat. He placed the envelope on the coffee table. He folded his hands. He looked at me. I let the silence sit for a moment. Long enough to be felt. Then I said, "I'm going to ask you some questions." I'd like honest answers. Not explanations. Not justifications. Honest answers. He nodded. I said, "Do you understand what you did this morning?" He said yes. I said, "Tell me. In your own words. Tell me what you did." And he did. He said he had come into my home without asking. He had taken something that belonged to me. He had disregarded what I said. He had spoken about my future, my living situation, my independence, as though his opinion on the matter was more valid than my own. He said the things he had said about the nursing home were cruel. He said the word cruel himself. I didn't prompt him. And I was glad, because it meant some part of him already knew it. I said, "Do you understand that what you did constitutes theft? Under the law?" He said yes. I said, "And does the fact that you didn't expect consequences make it less wrong?" He said no. Then he started to explain. He started talking about Vanessa, that she had been worried about me, that she had told him I seemed confused lately, forgetful, that she thought I wasn't managing as well as I appeared to be. He said he hadn't been thinking clearly. He said he'd gotten caught up in Vanessa's version of things and had stopped thinking for himself. I let him talk. I let him say all of it. And then I said very quietly, "Matthew, she didn't hold your hand and walk you into my home. She didn't pick up my keys. She didn't say the things you said to me this morning. You did. You made every one of those choices. And Vanessa being wrong about something does not make you any less responsible for acting on it." Silence. Then I told him about the year. Not to punish him. I want to be clear about that again, because it's important. I told him because I believed he genuinely did not know. I told him about the winter. About the days I didn't speak to another human being. About calling and leaving voicemails and waiting. About the loneliness that had settled into the house after Jerry died and the slow, painful, intentional work of finding myself again inside it. I told him about the day I drove to the dealership alone and asked good questions and bought my car and drove home and sat in my own driveway and felt, for the first time in months, like myself. He was crying by the time I finished. Quietly. He didn't wipe his eyes. He just let the tears fall, and I think there was something important in that. A man who is performing grief wipes his eyes. A man who is actually feeling it lets it fall. I said, "I love you, Matthew. I will love you until the last moment of my life, and that will not change. But love is not enough. Not by itself. Love without respect is not a relationship. It's just a claim." I told him my terms. First, he needed to decide who he wanted to be. Not who Vanessa wanted him to be. Not who was easier to be. Who he actually wanted to be, as a man and as a son. Second, the legal documents were staying exactly where they were. In Robert's files and in my possession. The revised will stood. A record of what had happened this morning would remain with Robert indefinitely. I told him to understand that this was not a threat. It was a fact. A fact that would follow any future choices he made. Third, he was to begin individual therapy. Not for my sake. For his. Because I needed him to find a way to understand how he had been capable of doing what he'd done today, and to make sure he was never capable of it again. Fourth, our relationship would be limited to occasional phone calls until I saw genuine, consistent change. Not words. Change. Fifth, he was not welcome in this house without an invitation from me. If and when I extended that invitation, it would be because I had decided I trusted him enough to. Not before. He agreed to every term. He said, "Mom, I love you. I am so sorry." I said, "I know. Keep going." He left. I closed the door behind him and I stood alone in my hallway and I breathed. Just breathed. Long and slow, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way you breathe when a storm has passed and you are checking yourself for damage. I found, to my genuine surprise, that I was all right. Part 2 continue in next video.